Okay, so this was the week three module, which you took this week. It's the quiz. So I talk about this 1785, the Comanche, the diplomacy between the Spanish and the Comanche. And I talked about this in the podcast, and Gwen talks about it as well, that the Spanish can't beat the Comanche, so they decide to make peace with them by bribing them, by giving them gifts. And this is something I want you to know about as part of the larger point I'm making about the Comanche being stronger than the Spanish in Texas. And the Spanish are unable to defeat the Comanche militarily. They're outnumbered here, and so they have to bribe the Comanche. And I've said this before, but this is not our usual thinking about European native encounters. We always think about the Europeans being on top. Not the case in many places, actually, as we now understand, but especially in Spanish Texas. So this is what I want you to take from that. The Comanches are tougher and more powerful than the Spanish in Texas. And then the details about that, the San Saba mission in the 1750s, how the Spanish are defeated there, and that stops the northward advance of the Spanish in Texas. The Comanche, the making peace with the Spanish in the 1780s. And one point that I'll just throw out there that I have talked about, the reason that the Comanches don't destroy San Antonio, which they could in an afternoon if they'd wanted to, San Antonio, or what's now downtown San Antonio, just happened to be outside the Comancheria. And so it wasn't part of Comanche territory. So the Comanche didn't really care that the Spanish were in what's now downtown San Antonio, because it was out of their territory. Same is true of East Texas. But when the Spanish tried to move up into San Saba, north and west of here, it was a whole different story. Okay. La Bahia, just something I want you to know. One of the three communities, Spanish communities, are communities in Texas that date from the Spanish period: San Antonio, Nacogdoches, and Goliad. And La Bahia, mission created there, Mission Presidio, designed for the Karankawa, our old buddies that we met in week one. And so I want you to know and hey, you may be mad that I want you to know that, but there were like 26 missions in Texas. Most of them failed. Only a handful were successful. So if I really wanted you to hate me, I could have you learn all the missions that were created in Texas in the 1700s. That would drive you nuts. But, why would I do that? It's stupid. It's completely pointless. I do want you to know the ones that were successful because, again, I just want you to have a sense of the importance of the Spanish heritage in Texas, because it's one of the things that makes Texas, Texas, and it affects you to this very day. I'm totally into borders. You need to know borders. And I've said this before, and the Nueces River, talked about it in the podcast, put it in the outline, I think. From the Spanish-Mexican point of view, that's the southern border of Texas, or that's the border of Texas, not the Rio Grande, which is what we think of as the border of Texas today. So that's a specific question, but I'm interested in borders, and I talk a lot about it, something in podcasts, and it's something that I want you to know, that the shape of Texas in the period that we're talking about is radically different from the shape of Texas that we have today. And the way we got the shape of Texas today is very historical. And if you know the borders of Texas, you really know a lot of the history of Texas. So I want you to know the Nueces was from the point of view of the Spanish and the Mexicans, the Nueces River, not the Rio Grande. This was from the podcast number 4 about Galvez. There's a really nice resort in Galveston called Galvez, which they just redone. And I ask you to listen to that podcast. I think it's very interesting that cattle from Texas supported the American Revolution. Cattle from Spanish Texas went to feed the revolutionists, and the Spanish in Texas and Louisiana helped the American Revolution. we don't think about Texas in the American Revolution. We don't make that connection. But I wanted you to make that connection for this class because I think it's interesting, gives you a little bit more a sophisticated understanding of the past here. Now, just because I think it's interesting doesn't mean that you think it's interesting. And I realize that. I do think I have pretty good taste, but you know what? Not everybody shares the same taste. But if I think it's interesting and I put it in the course, then you may not think it's interesting, but you'll need to know it, or at least, the basics of it. So if you listen to that podcast that I posted that was separate from my lecture, this is what it talked about. And this should have been a pretty easy question. This was a really unfair. Well, I don't want to, I take that back. Not unfair, but again, I wanted you to listen to that podcast. I'm getting a little frustrated because I think there's a portion of students, not a lot, but a portion of students that are kind of blowing off the work in this class. And that, again, that podcast that I asked you to listen to that was separate from my lecture podcast, it does mention Thomas Jefferson writing a letter and thanking the governor of Louisiana, Galvez, for all his help, including the cattle from Texas. So, yeah, I have to admit, that's a tough one. That's a tougher question than they normally ask. But I just want to send a signal. I want you to listen to this. And I thought it was a detail that would have jumped out. But maybe that was a tough, I have to admit, that was probably the toughest question I asked this whole semester. Fajitas, if you watch that video again, I post these things. I want you to watch them. It would have been very clear what Mama Nifa, and of course, if you're from Houston, you know all about Nifas. She is the one that popularized fajitas. She didn't invent fajitas. Actually, vaqueros were eating fajitas in the 1700s, but the video talks about her popularizing it in that food in the 1970s. And of course, now fajitas are everywhere. You can get fajitas in Paris and Bombay. Anyway, they're ubiquitous, and it didn't used to be that way. So that was one of those. I just wanted to make sure you watched that video, which I thought was a fun video about something that most of us love, which is Tex-Mex, right? It's one of the things that makes Texas, Tex-Mex. Not the healthiest food, I have to admit. Really good, though. I think I asked about San Juan Batista twice. So there that is again. I may ask it on the midterm. And if I do, I hope you get it right. Gateway to Texas, built in 1700 after the failure of the missions in the 1690s. It's part of the Spanish infrastructure in Texas. And it's the gateway to Texas. It was in what's now Mexico today. It's south of the Rio Grande, but it was the way folks from the interior of Mexico, it was the way they entered into Spanish Texas, was through this mission. And so that's why it's called the gateway to Texas and the mother mission to Texas, even though it doesn't exist in what today is Texas. Like I say, it was on the river crossing of the Rio Grande that allowed folks to come in from the interior into what's now Texas. Okay. Another question about water from the Edwards Aquifer. I talk about it. I just think it's interesting, and I think I asked that on the other midterm. Women in Spanish Texas. Very interesting, the property rights that they had. I devoted a portion of the podcast lecture to this. I think it was also on the outline, and it's important for you to know. It's I like surprises in history, and this is, I think, a real surprise. We don't think of the Spanish as being more progressive, and I'm putting that in quotes, than the British. And it wasn't like the Spanish were necessarily progressive. That's not why they gave women right. It was just that it was so dangerous here, and all the men were getting killed all the time. But that women had far more rights in Spanish Texas than they did in the colonies of British North America, especially when it turned out in property rights, the right to sue, that kind of a thing. I just think it's really interesting. Secularized. Okay, that was I wouldn't say that was a nasty question, but it was something that is a detail. I talked about it in the podcast. It's one of those things that's in the outline as well. And the secularization of the missions, it meant that the Spanish government pulled its support. And this is very significant because once they did that, the missions went into a decline. And as I said in my lecture, they were ruins by the 1830s. So it marks this turning point in the history of missions in Texas. And by 1800, most of the Spanish missions in San Antonio were secularized. La Bahia was secularized a little bit later. So that is I have to admit, that's a detailed question, but it was in the podcast and it was in the outline. Which is true of the Spanish missions in San Antonio. I talked about this when I talk about Indian diplomacy. Remember, the Comanches beat up the Lipan Apache, who beat up the Colotecan, and that's why the Colotecan Indian group sought shelter in the missions. Once they came into the missions, they gained some protection from the Spanish. The Spanish provided them with horses occasionally, and the different Colotecan Indian groups would ride with the Spanish against the Lipan Apache and the Comanche. They teamed up. I talked about this in my podcast. The Colotecan Indian group it's really a misnomer. There wasn't one Colotecan Indian native indigenous groups. The Colotecan were indigenous people made up of a dozens of smaller indigenous group. But just for the ease of this course, I'm still using the word Colotecan. But just realize that word, there's not one Colotecan tribe like there is a Comanche tribe and a Lipan Apache tribe. It's different, smaller indigenous groups. And, like I say, there are descendants of the Colotecans in San Antonio to this day. I dare say that there are students listening to this very podcast who have Colotecan blood coursing through their veins. I would be surprised if there weren't more than just a few. If your family's been in San Antonio, as is true of many of the students at UTSA, for hundreds of years, or at least some students, you almost certainly have Colotecan blood coursing through your veins at some point. But the Colotecans as a group, these small Indian groups, by 1800, they had all but disappeared. Their language disappeared and disease caught up with them. Okay, 1803, important date. U.S. buys Louisiana, and suddenly Spanish Texas and later Mexican Texas gets a ferocious and very dangerous enemy. Of course, by 1845, Texas will be part of the United States. So the purchase of Louisiana by the U.S. in 1803 is a real red letter day in the history of Texas, because what we have is a very predatory country, the United States, that suddenly is next door licking its chops because slaveholders in the United States, they want, especially the land of East Texas, to grow cotton, because cotton is worth a fortune, and it's what makes fortunes. And this land is undeveloped. It's some of the richest cotton growing land in all of North America. But of course, along with cotton comes slave labor as well. Remember, slavery equal cotton, cotton equals slavery. The folks that were forced to cultivate cotton because they were enslaved were African Americans who were brought into Texas beginning really in the 1820s. So this doesn't happen in 1803, but you can feel the breath of the United States on Texas beginning in 1803. Dominant activity in Texas, talked about this, the vaquero, ranching, the cattle drives. This was in the notes as well, and I thought a pretty straightforward question. Not a legacy of the Spanish period of Texas history. Well, we know the churches, the language, Spanish language, creation of San Antonio. So the answer is university and colleges. Those aren't created until after Texas becomes Anglo. And let's see. This one, I assigned the readings on the missions. And that's where this question came from. And those readings talked about the Franciscan order, who were the priests who built and maintained the missions beginning in the 1700s. They weren't perfect, but pretty amazing, very tough. No one can deny how tough they were. You not only did you have to know your religion, but you had to know architecture. You had to know how to be a farmer. You had to be able to deal with the different native groups. So that's where that question comes from, the reading I assigned for that week that was separate from the podcast lectures.